disciples. It stresses a more personal relationship, a more direct relationship in a way, as opposed to somebody who is deputized and thrown into the work. The beloved disciple, and for convenience I will refer to the beloved disciple as being John, is spiritually decisive. In the gospel, John immediately takes up the call from Christ, so much so that he drops what he's doing right there and then, which were his nets as a fisherman, and followed. He recognized the Logos and responded immediately, so much so that he left his dad in the boat. Oh, hey! So, unfortunately for his father, he got it right away. John has a willingness to be transformed. In the early portions of the gospel, John is a very angry man. When people don't react right to Jesus or to the disciples or the community, he kind of says, "Master, shall we call down fire on them and burn them?" As opposed to, perhaps they might want to sit down and have a coffee and talk about our disagreements. No, it's, can I call down fire and burn them? It's pretty intense, actually. John is described as a son of thunder by Jesus. And I've always taken that to kind of say, well, a pretty angry young man. Together with his brother James, he's got a bit of a temper, and he's self-righteous. The example, actually the literal example, it says, "Lord, do you want us to call down the fire of heaven to destroy them?" Now there's a model for ecumenism. Yet now, John is the beloved disciple. Someone, as you'll remember from our institutional narrative this morning, is the apostle of fraternal love. You don't go from being an angry young man to being the apostle of love without a willingness to give up, to give up those things that are holding you back. So a willingness to be transformed. There's a saying, I used to know the Latin for it, but and of course, there's cliches like, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with, something or other, a lot of coffee. But half is done when the beginning is done. Simply the willingness to say, you know what, I might want to consider a wider perspective. I might want to look at who I am. And instead of turning around and pointing out all the things that may or may not be wrong with the people around us, I might want to take a look in the mirror. Often, and this I'm stealing from a well-known Buddhist teacher, so if he ever watches this, I hope he forgives me. Nobody walks into a doctor and says, "Doctor, what's right with me?" So the willingness to be transformed also contains a thorough accounting of the things that you do right. The things that you care for and the things that are important. It is a willingness to look at yourself honestly. And I think somebody like John, our angry young man, is very willing to do that. Holy listening. Jesus in the Gospels, in the canonical Gospels, and even occasionally in the Gospel of John, works a lot of miracles. It's a lot of flash, it's a lot of sizzle. If you didn't believe me before, check this out. John didn't need that. He wasn't transformed by that. He was transformed by listening, by paying attention, by listening to the words of the Logos. He was attentive to the message, that of love. Because throughout the whole of the Gospel of John, other than, of course, the angry bits about members of their former community, there's actually a lot of love. Peace I give to you, my peace I give you. Not as the world gives, do I give unto you. Is actually the extended version of the quote that Sister Trish read this morning. There is a lot of peace. There is a lot of love. Love one another as I have loved you. And that, just like John, we're called to be holy listeners. We're called to give sacred attention to the spiritual journeys of our brothers and sisters, sharing their burdens and being able to share our own in turn. This goes hand in hand with being spiritually decisive and being willing to be transformed. The beloved disciple was loyal. He was present at the garden and at the cross when everybody else ran away. When times got tough, as we know famously, Peter said, "That guy, I have no idea who you're talking about. Really, you saw me with this guy. I think you've been snacking on the local mushrooms. Jesus, I don't know him." Everybody else ran away, literally for their lives. Truth be told, I would probably be Peter. I would probably, do Nike Jitsu like nobody's business. John didn't. Not only did he not, it wasn't like, he was even front row in the crowd, is that he was up there, completely oblivious to everything else, along with the Magdalene, along with Mary, the mother of Jesus, saying, "You know what? I'm not going anywhere unless you tell me to go somewhere." Patient. Certainly someone who goes from wanting to cast fire down on folks to someone who is leaning on Jesus during the Last Supper, has learned a bit of calm and patience, not just with the world, but with himself. Humble. And this we rely on tradition more than any kind of scholarly sense of who John was. That in the beginning of the gospel, you have John mentioned by name in all the parts where he is angry, where all the parts where he is frustrated, where he is first following Jesus. But by the time you reach the end of the gospel, the beloved disciple is only identified as the beloved disciple. Not identifying himself by name in the gospel attributed to him, nor did his community attribute it to him. Serving. The apostle understood the importance of service, as exemplified by having Jesus, by Jesus having him prepare and ready the Passover meal. If of course, we all know the thing, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. If you want to teach, if you want to lead, you must serve. And the beloved disciple is willing to break out the coloring, which I think is important. Courageous. This is obvious, of course, by looking at the cross. That takes guts. I couldn't do it. Trustworthy. And this is an interesting thing that we're going to go back to. The example here is, of course, at the moment of the crucifixion, the Logos, Christ, says to John, "Behold thy mother. I trust you enough to have you look after my own family." In other words, you are my family. You are now, this is the, son, behold thy mother, mother, behold thy son. What does that make John? Jesus' brother. You are family. That's what the trust is about. Contemplative and prayerful. Willing to engage their own path of spirituality, not simply be transformed in the church parking lot, so to speak. He went to Mount Tabor with Christ to pray, and the Logos asked him to pray for him on the Mount of Olives, and went to the temple to pray in the Acts of the Apostles. Studiousness. John knew the Scriptures. In the Gospel that bears his name, many references are made to Acts of the Logos that were fulfillment of Scripture. You can't say this if you don't know your references. Now, of course, the Gospel of John was not literally written by John. I mean, it could, written by a community or a series of authors, a series of people who have written stuff backwards into it, particularly their own disputes with their parent faith tradition. But at the same time, the idea of a community that is learned, that is intelligent, that is actively involved in its own education, enough to list its sources, to say, what, we've paid attention to the tradition that has gone before us. We've paid attention to those scriptures, and here they are in harmony with our own. And of course, then there is the John that is given the title of theologian. which Dr. Bean could tell you more about. I'm not so good at that kind of thing. Finally, and most importantly, love. Every one of these other things: decisiveness, transformation, listening, patience, loyalty, humility, service, courageousness, trustworthiness. If you have love, as St. Paul might say, well, you have everything else. Behold thy mother. This doesn't only, this idea of love doesn't only link Mary to John. As I mentioned, it makes John Jesus' brother. They become family. And that that his disciples, that the Logos' disciples are family. And furthermore, especially in this act where he says, son, behold thy mother, mother, behold thy son, that family is who you choose. You choose your family, you choose your community, you choose your friends, you choose your brothers and sisters. As a part of all those other things, as a part of being decisive, as a part of a willingness to be transformed, you make that choice. Your path is yours. Nobody turns around and says, you must do this, other than have an open mind and bring your brain. And in an abrupt ending, that's where I have. So I'd like to take any questions, comments, concerns over my wacky speaking style. Anything, any questions you have. Perhaps not just about the topic or the tradition, but about the church as well, because I see them as being intertwined. Come on, not even what's your favorite drink or what kind of music you listen to?
Just got a question.
Sure.
Not about what you mentioned, but about the book of Revelation. It's often, or usually, been associated in my mind anyway with John. Is that part of the Johannite tradition?
Absolutely. Did you want to speak on Revelation, the role of Revelation?
Sure.
In the church?
I guess I walked in just what I can. The book of Revelation traditionally was ascribed to John the Apostle. But in the Orthodox tradition, I think it's a little clear that there is this division between John the Theologian and John the Apostle. And I think that probably historically there's good reason to think that these were developed at least by two different authors, if not by two different communities. And I have a tendency to think that it's the same community generating two different texts that both get the name of the leader of the community. There are distinct similarities between the fourth gospel and the book of Revelation in terms of the Christology, as long as we read Revelation in a particular way. Its roots in Judaic practice, mysticism, for example, and also just linguistically, just in terms of the way the Greek is written, there are distinct similarities. So I would be loath to kind of separate out the Apocalypse from the Johannite tradition. I think it is part of the same community. It is part of the same tradition. It represents a different kind of spiritual journey than the gospel does. I think the gospel is much more rooted in the historical unfolding of this community, whereas the Apocalypse is much more oriented toward the spiritual journey of the individual, toward his or her own apotheosis.
Thank you, sir.
I think another interesting thing to note is that, particularly when you take a look at the Johannite community, the early Johannite community, which the Eucharist was central enough to have fights over, to have arguments over, and then you look at the liturgy, you look at the Mass like we had this morning, and then you read Revelation, symbolically there's, it almost reads like the order of liturgy with, with the incense. Oh yes, so, it has a very, high and spiritual sense of that kind of sacrifice, divine in the matter, for example. So I definitely think there's a lot of connections, and there's a lot of things to work with within Revelation. I don't view it as being the world come crashing down type of thing, but more, as His Grace said, something that reflects our own spiritual path and journey in very powerful language.
The Gospel of John is a Greek gospel. Just the structure of the language is too uniquely Hellenic for it to be otherwise.
And the amount of sort of artful use of Greek rhetoric and Greek structure and
there are
words
puns
in Greek and the puns on the Greek words.
There are puns that only make sense in Greek. So, whereas in Matthew, for example, there are puns that are written in Greek that don't make any sense in Greek, but they make sense in Aramaic. So there's indication that might be a Greek translation of an earlier Aramaic text. It does not seem to be the case here.
Would the practice tradition have been in Aramaic and then written in Greek, or was there kind of multiple languages?
You're talking about just the day-to-day language of the original community?
Yeah, so
Probably was heavily Aramaic.
Yeah.
Because it is coming out of the temple and the synagogue tradition. I think the importation of Greeks and Greek-speaking Romans into the tradition after about 90 AD, I think does actually change the shape of the community in a profound way. So I think that these questions about the language are really, really important, because I think that what we think about the community is in part shaped by the language that community uses to express itself.
And you can tell when the content of the community changes by when the language changes.
Yeah.
For example, the thing that, at some point along the way, whereas everybody started off as Jewish, that now they're having to explain Jewish terms.
Right.
And so it can't be to Jews because the Jews would have already known that.
Yeah, those glosses, rabbi, which means teacher.
Yeah. Right.
It's like saying teacher, which means teacher. You
Yeah.
would never have to do that if you're talking.
And
about
at the same time, you look in terms of Greek, you look at the fact that right out of the gate, they're saying in the beginning was the word, the logos, which of course is Greek. So.
Yeah, it's Greek in a conceptual way, not just a linguistic way. Of course, there's a Syriac word for word, but it doesn't have the kind of philosophical ramifications that logos does, because logos isn't just word. It's word, it's tongue, it's speech, it's language, it's mind, it's reason. It's already all of these things by the first century CE.
A little twist on that question that a claim I made yesterday in the talk in the morning, and I kind of stick by this, that it's such artful Greek and it's such beautiful and poetic Greek in the gospel. At the same time, the thought world of that place and time is kind of in a liminal space between the thought world of the Aramaic world and Semitic language and desert spirituality and the urban Hellenistic thought world and the Greek language. And I think part of what you see in John is the really artful use of Greek linguistic and conceptual precision, carefully deployed to fuck the mind up in such
We'll fix that in post.
to break the mind open. Is that better? We catch that, right? Go ahead. To break the mind open in such a way that it approximates the kind of thinking that's more characteristic of desert spirituality. So, for instance, the use of symbol and metaphor, but multiple symbols and metaphors to point to the same thing. So it's totally about this, and then the next chapter, actually it's completely about this other thing, which is quite a different image. And the two things, when placed in against each other, kind of open up a larger transcendent space. So, yes, Greek, but
the language, the Greek language that's deployed in the fourth gospel is just so gorgeous. It is beautiful poetry. So, and that prologue, if you listen to it in Greek, is just gorgeous.
Historically, the secessionists community formed a stronghold anywhere geographically. Like, we know Rome became part, and Greek became part, but did they survive enough as a community to become a strong point, or?
That's a tough question to answer, because we know in a general term where the Johannines, so to speak, went and where they existed. It's just hard to say which side of that split existed where. But without a doubt, the followers of John, traditionally at least, are all in Asia Minor, Ephesus.
Yeah.
Ephesus, Smyrna, Turkey, basically.
Which connects it, of course, back to the question of Revelation, because Revelation has this frame dialogue where there's the letters to the 7 churches. And those
Yes.
7 churches are all in Asia Minor. They're all in Anatolia and Turkey.
Yeah. I'm planning on visiting one day. But
Conclave in Ephesus.
yes, absolutely.
It's a bit of a ruin, but I'm sure
Your
the
lips
pitch
to
tends
God's
something.
ears.
If they have kangaroo, we're good.
I'd like to suggest we continue questions over coffee
Sure.
and take a break if that's cool. Can I just suggest that we thank His Eminence for that wonderful talk?
Beer and the